Hello everyone, my name is Qaddoura. I'm the State Senator representing Senate District 30, and I'm honored to have Julia Vaughn, the Executive Director of Common Cause, join me to talk about fair redistricting in Indiana and the importance of this topic and how it impacts your life personally. Why do we need fair maps in Indiana? Julia, welcome. I'm honored to be with you today.
Thanks for
and
having me.
would love to learn from you and share with my district and Hoosiers across the state a few critical thoughts of why we deeply care about fair maps. And I would love to start with, can you give us a brief about Common Cause in Indiana and your role with the organization?
Sure. Common Cause is a national, nonpartisan, grassroots lobbying organization. We were founded way back in 1970, so we've been around a while. We work for open, honest, and accountable government with a heavy emphasis on voting rights because that's how we get things done in this country. Voters have power, and we want to make sure that average citizens have the same political power as wealthy corporations or wealthy individuals. So it's all about making sure that the average person can make their voice heard in politics and in the legislature.
Excellent. In this last session, we've seen different pieces of legislation that were passed, and some of it came across as restricting voting rights in Indiana. Why do we care about expanding and protecting voting rights in Indiana? How does it impact our democracy?
Well, unfortunately, Indiana has some poor stats when it comes to voter turnout. Over the past decade, we've ranked in the bottom 10 in terms of voter participation, and that means that not everybody is being heard in our process. And I don't think we get good public policies when only a small fraction of your population is having a say in the election of people who will make important decisions about the kind of health care we have access to, the amount of taxes that we pay. So if we're going to have a really inclusive society, we've got to have an inclusive political process, and that means expanding the right to vote and making sure that everybody has easy access to the ballot. We've got a lot of work to do on that here in Indiana.
And that brings me to a point, which is in this last session, we've talked extensively about the integrity of elections. And I was surprised that we didn't spend too much time talking about the integrity of redistricting and drawing maps in Indiana. And my question to you is, what is the role? I mean, the two parties, the political parties in the past, have engaged in gerrymandering. So it's not one party or the other. And what we're trying to say is that this issue is much more important than any political party. This impacts generations to come. So can you comment on that in terms of why, if you're Republican or Democrat or you don't affiliate with any political party, why should you care about this issue?
Well, because the way the district lines are drawn, where they fall, will impact very much who gets elected in our state at both the congressional and state legislative level. It will impact the ability of voters in those districts to make their voices heard. We have too many districts in our state that were drawn to be non-competitive, that are supposed to be safe for one party or the other. And when that happens, it impacts voter turnout. If people think my vote isn't going to make a difference in this election, too often they stay home. People who are elected out of uncompetitive districts don't have to listen to voters, so accountability is impacted. It can be difficult to get your elected official to pay attention to you if they are guaranteed re-election simply because of where the district lines fall. And we don't have truly representative government in Indiana, I believe, with the current imbalance we have inside the State House and inside our congressional delegation. We have a huge Republican supermajority inside this building, yet, Republicans statewide tend not to win with 60, 70% of the vote. So I think there is an imbalance inside our State House which extends to an imbalance around our state, and it impacts the quality of life we have here. So redistricting really does matter.
This is a critical point that you bring up, which is the actual representation in Indiana, if I look back at the last 4, 5, or 6 election cycles, in 2008, President Barack Obama won Indiana, for example. Prior to Governor Mitch Daniels for almost 16 years, we had Democratic governors. So the imbalance can be clearly illustrated by looking at the numbers in both the House and the Senate. Does it matter if the party that is gerrymandering the maps is Democratic or Republican Party? Maybe rephrasing the question one more time, how can we as citizens, as people that care about future generations and their ability to have equal and fair representation, how can we impact that process? And so maybe you can talk about the process first and then how we can impact the process.
Right. Well, we've got to have a more open and transparent redistricting process. Now, the coalition that we lead, All In for Democracy, has been working for 6, 7 years inside this building to pass redistricting reform. We think we need to change both who is in charge of drawing the districts and how the districts are drawn. The who piece is probably most important. It's obviously a direct conflict of interest for the same people who are going to run in the districts to draw the districts. So we think there needs to be some separation. Clearly, our Constitution gives the General Assembly a role in this process, but it doesn't say they have to have complete and total control. So our idea is to follow the lead of a lot of other states, including our neighbors Michigan and Ohio, and give this job first to a group of citizens, a multi-partisan group of citizens, people who are Republican, Democrat, and neither Republican nor Democrat, and have them conduct a process out in the open that is transparent and that gives people real opportunities to participate.
This is a point that was raised in the last few years about the term independent redistricting commission, and unfortunately it was mistakenly portrayed or explained as, well, there are no humans who are independent. And what we continuously try to educate the public by saying, by independent we mean a body that is independent from the General Assembly.
Exactly.
And in every profession, we have conflict of interest policies that you have to disclose the conflict. So imagine when it comes to our democracy, what is, in your view, what is the obstacle, the main obstacle that is preventing the Indiana General Assembly after the last 10, 15 years worth of attempts and trials to get the redistricting, a citizens redistricting commission? What is the main obstacle that is preventing us from moving forward on this issue?
Well, I think it's power. It's, it recognizes that gerrymandering is a very effective political tool. It's really the best way to predetermine election results. And so folks who have power don't want to give it up. But I think they need to recognize that tides turn. They're in control now, but sometime in the future they may not be. So the same tool that they're using to benefit their party now will be used against them in the future. And so let's create a process that is balanced, that's fair, because that's what Hoosiers want. We want fair maps that don't benefit one political party over another, that don't divide communities illogically and prevent people from making their voices heard.
And it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. I think we should all share the concern that if maps are drawn behind closed doors without public input, that on its own should raise red flags for the public. Why is it secret?
Exactly.
And so can you talk a little bit more about your efforts this last couple of months? You've engaged with other allies and organizations across the state in bringing more transparency to the process. You've collected feedback, public comments, and you launched a website to ask the citizens to help with drawing their own maps. Can you talk a little bit about this effort?
Yeah, it's really a two-pronged effort. Our coalition, All In for Democracy, when we failed last year to pass reform, we regrouped and we said, how are we going to impact redistricting in 2021 and also make the argument for redistricting reform? So we came up with a two-pronged effort. The first is we created our own Citizens Commission. We said, well, if the legislature won't reform redistricting, we'll show them how it should be done. So we have recruited, we had 300 people raise their hands and say, we'd like to do this. So we had a really tough job whittling it down to the 9 that we arrived at, but they are 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 3 people who are neither Republican nor Democrat. They've held virtual public hearings, 10 of them. We heard from people all over the state. Really 2 main things we wanted to find out. What do you think about these current districts? What's wrong with them? What's right with them? What do you want to see in the new maps? And then we also asked folks to identify the communities of interest in their region. Because some communities of interest are obvious. They're cities, they're towns, they're townships, but others aren't. They might be a historic neighborhood, an industry that's important in one region of the state, like the steel industry up in Northwest Indiana. The Amish are a very important community of interest in some areas of our state. So we think it's important that the General Assembly have some way, and the way we think is best is public input of identifying those important communities of interest so that when they start drawing the lines, they don't divide a community and again, hurt them in their efforts to make their voices heard politically. So that's the first part. We are showing the General Assembly with this parallel commission how this process should be conducted in an open and transparent way that prioritizes the voices of citizens. Then we are also working on a public mapping website. We're going to have a competition. We're putting up some real cash prizes, $3,000 for the person.
$3,000. Be sure that you engage in this process.
Exactly. Enter this competition because, you know, we want to see what Hoosiers can do in terms of drawing districts. So not only will the person who submits the winning map walk away with a pocket full of money, but we will use their map to compare to what the General Assembly comes up with. And we think our process and our map drawers will come up with districts that better serve the needs of voters and communities than the legislature will.
That's a well-articulated thought that if you keep communities of interest intact, that will allow them to have fair representation and their voices will be heard at the General Assembly via legislation and so on. I've learned through attending some of these meetings about concepts that maybe might be helpful to share with the public. So there's the concept of packing and cracking. Can you educate Hoosiers about what does packing and cracking mean in the context of drawing maps?
Absolutely, yeah. Packing and cracking, we usually think of it in terms of racial gerrymandering, but it can also refer to partisan gerrymandering as well. Packing is when you take a whole bunch of voters who are alike, maybe they're black voters, maybe they're Democrat voters, and you smash them all into 1 or 2 districts. So that, you know, these districts are overwhelmingly Democratic, but that also means that those voters' influence is kind of wasted, right? They're all packed in the same district. A way to negatively impact the ability of voters to make their voices heard, whether they're a minority, whether they're the wrong party. And then cracking is sort of the opposite of that. Instead of cramming a whole bunch of similar voters in the same district, you crack them up into a whole bunch of districts so that there's not enough of them. There's no critical mass in any one district that they're able to make their voices heard. So tacking is another term that we use. That's where you kind of tack a community onto a district. Similar to cracking, there's just a little group of them. They can't effectively make their voices heard in the process. So we use a lot of technical terms when it comes to redistricting, but they're pretty easy concepts to understand. Again, it's all about who's going to have influence.
It's a math problem. The more,
it is.
And you know, whatever political party is in charge, they try to maximize the number of their districts. One of the main issues I noticed with gerrymandering or the unfair maps that we've seen in Indiana is that certain communities that are packed or cracked into different districts that have an elected official that might not represent the values or the policy preferences of that community of interest. And that dilutes the power of the citizen to have his or her voice heard in the process. To conclude This whole redistricting process happens once every 10 years, and we rely on the United States Census data. So it's important, that's why we're talking about it today, because we as legislators will be called back to session sometimes this fall to redraw the maps. What is your message to the citizens across the state? How can they be Republicans, Democrats, non-affiliated, can engage in that process to be sure that their voices are heard and that the Indiana General Assembly is held accountable by the people for drawing transparent, fair maps that guarantee that each citizen is going to have their voice in the process. So what are the actual pragmatic, practical action steps that our citizens can take to ensure that this upcoming legislative process to redraw the districts is going to be as fair as possible?
Well, please go to commoncause.org or allinfordemocracy.org and read our report from the Indiana Citizens Redistricting Commission. Once you do that, send it to your legislator. Ask them to read it and follow the recommendations that it contains in terms of creating a fair and open, transparent process that will result in maps that prioritize the needs of voters and communities. You can do things like write a letter to the editor, call into a talk radio show. We've got yard signs. One of the easiest things you can do is stick a reform redistricting yard sign in your front yard. Meet with your legislator. Host a house party. Talk to your friends about redistricting reform. There are lots of good resources. Then the best way you can leave your mark, though, is to enter our districtor mapping competition. Wouldn't that be a great thing to put on your resume, that I drew the winning maps for this redistricting competition? So the exciting thing, I think, Senator, is that this time, this is going to be my third redistricting process. So I've seen it before, and I can tell you, there is so much more public recognition this time around that this is really important. I think Hoosiers have a sense that the way the lines were drawn 10 years ago was very manipulative. And I'm not going to claim that the maps 10 years prior weren't gerrymandered as well, because they were. But the outcome of elections over the past 10 years, we've seen very little turnover, in fact, no turnover at the congressional level. We've seen almost no competition in state legislative races, and we've had poor voter turnout to really bear testament to that. So I think Hoosiers have a sense that there's something not quite right with politics, and many people have traced that back to redistricting in 2011. So they want to make sure that the maps that are drawn this year are fair. That's all we're asking for. We're not asking for maps that tip the balance one way or the other. We just want maps that were fair and that considered our opinions and that were drawn out in the open and with enough time given to the public so that they could really engage with debate with their legislators. So, you know, we've been given a real opportunity because of the census delay. Usually redistricting is done within the regular session. There are all these other issues that are happening to take attention away from it. There's not going to be anything else this fall but redistricting. And we have all of these months beforehand to educate people and to get organized. So I would just encourage Hoosiers to equip yourself with information. We're happy to provide that and offer any answers to questions you might have, but just get involved because this is really, really important.
It's once in a decade type of opportunity to restore fairness in our political system. I'm inspired by examples that we've seen across the country where actually not only citizens but even businesses and corporations in our communities engaged meaningfully, including here in Indiana this past session, when they saw that there were a couple of pieces of legislation that were moving forward that could potentially restrict voting rights in Indiana. And corporations deeply care about the well-being of their employees, and the employees are members of our communities, and these employees and members of the community, they want to live under the shade of democracy. They want everyone to be represented equally. So I'm hopeful that our community, members in our community, our corporations, our businesses, everyone gets engaged in this process to be sure that we get it done, and we get it done right this time for the benefit of our democracy and the future of Indiana. Julia, you've been amazing. I urge everyone to visit Common Cause and to reach out to Julia if she can be of any help to you. I urge you to engage in this process. We still have 3 to 4 months to redraw our maps. I urge you to show up at the State House to speak with your legislators, to participate in the public comment phase during that process, and make your voices heard. This is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This should not be a partisan issue. If you care about democracy, then this is your opportunity to join us in doing something right for Indiana. Thank you, Julia. I look forward to many more engagements. Appreciate it. Thank you.